At the southern edge of Liverpool, beyond the housing estates, railway lines, industrial roads, and open stretches of Merseyside, there was once a factory built with the confidence of a country that still believed in mass production. It was not a modest workshop. It was not a small local plant hidden behind a trading estate. Halewood was built to be vast. It was a place of presses, welding lines, painted steel, moving conveyors, clocking in cards, night shifts, canteens, union meetings, delivery trucks, and workers whose lives were tied to the rhythm of car production. For decades, the name Ford Halewood meant something direct and powerful. It meant work. It meant wages coming into homes across Liverpool. Knowsley, St Helens, Cheshire, Lancashire, and North Wales. It meant apprentices learning trades. It meant families planning mortgages, holidays, weddings, and futures around the security of a factory job. It meant local shops, pubs, clubs, taxi firms, suppliers, and small businesses living within the pull of one enormous employer. And what Halewood made was not distant or obscure. Ford Anglias, Corsairs, Capris, Escorts, Orions, cars that ordinary people recognized. Cars that appeared outside schools, on terraced streets, in factory car parks, on holiday roads beside football grounds, and outside new suburban homes. These were not machines for the elite. They were part of everyday Britain. They carried workers to shifts, families to the seaside, children to school, and young drivers into adulthood. At its height, Halewood was more than a car plant. It was a statement. It said that Merseyside, a region often spoken about through unemployment and industrial anxiety, still had a place inside the future of manufacturing. It said that British workers could build cars on a massive scale. It said that an American company could put down roots in the Northwest and become part of local identity. But the same factory that once represented security would later become a warning. By the late 1990s, the industrial world that had created Halewood was no longer the world deciding its future. Ford's European strategy had changed. The Escort, the car most closely tied to Halewood's fame, was reaching the end of its life. Its successor, the Ford Focus, would not be built there. The work that had sustained the plant for generations was being moved elsewhere. That decision left Halewood facing the question every industrial town fears. What happens when the product that built a place no longer belongs to it? The answer was not simple closure. It was more complicated, and in some ways more revealing. Ford stopped building Ford cars at Halewood. Jaguar arrived. Land Rover followed. Ford stayed on part of the site through transmissions, then electric drive units. The old factory world did not vanish in one dramatic moment. It was divided, rebranded, modernized, automated, and forced to justify itself again and again. That is why Halewood's story matters. It is not only the story of a factory that declined. It is the story of a factory that survived by becoming something else, and of the people who had to live through every reinvention. To understand why Halewood mattered, you have to begin with need. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, Britain's car industry was expanding. More families were buying cars. Roads were improving. Suburbs were growing. The private motor car was moving from aspiration into ordinary life. Ford already had a major British base at Dagenham, but Dagenham couldn't carry everything. The company needed more space, more capacity, and access to a large workforce. Merseyside needed something too. Liverpool still had a powerful name, but the economic foundations beneath the city were shifting. The docks and old industrial systems no longer offered the same certainty. Traditional forms of work were under pressure. For many families, secure industrial employment was not just welcome. It was essential. Halewood offered Ford land, transport links, proximity to Liverpool's industrial networks, and a workforce ready for stable jobs. It offered the kind of site a company chose when it was thinking not in hundreds of cars, but in hundreds of thousands. The first car to define the new plant was the Ford Anglia. The Anglia was not glamorous, and that was part of its importance. It was compact, recognizable, practical, and affordable. Its backward-sloping rear window gave it a distinctive shape, but its real meaning was social. It belonged to a Britain where ordinary families were beginning to imagine movement differently. A car in the driveway meant more than transport. It meant a weekend could stretch beyond the bus route. It meant work could be reached more easily. It meant relatives could be visited, children could be taken away for the day, and the world beyond the neighborhood became more accessible. When Anglias began coming off the Halewood line, they carried more than steel panels, glass engines and wheels. They carried a promise. Merseyside would not simply watch industrial change happen somewhere else. It would help build the machines of the new age. But factories like Halewood were always built on a bargain. The company received land, infrastructure, support and labor. The region received employment. Workers accepted the discipline of the assembly line. Repetition, noise, shift work, pressure, inspection, and the physical strain of doing one task again and again until it became muscle memory. In return, they expected decent wages, respect, and a future. Inside the factory, the process had its own language. Steel panels arrived as parts. Bodies were welded, painted, trimmed, fitted, checked, started, and driven out as finished cars. Every station depended on the one before it. Every delay moved down the line like a shockwave. A missing component mattered. A poor fit mattered. A stoppage mattered. A dispute mattered. The whole system worked only when thousands of separate actions were held together with industrial precision. For the people on the line, the work could be exhausting. It could be monotonous. It could wear down the body. But it also produced something visible. A car left the factory and entered the world. Workers could see the result of their labor on the road. They could point to it and say, "We built that." That mattered. And in Merseyside, work mattered deeply. Halewood did not simply employ individuals. It supported households. A Ford wage could shape a family's confidence. It could help pay for a house, keep children clothed, keep food on the table, and give people a sense that tomorrow would be manageable. The factory became part of local life because its wages moved through the community. But from the beginning, Halewood carried a hidden vulnerability. It was important locally, but it was never fully controlled locally. It was part of Ford's wider European system. Decisions about future models, investment, productivity, labor costs, and long-term strategy would not be made only in Merseyside. They would be made across boardrooms, markets, governments, and competing plants. That truth sat quietly beneath the optimism. Halewood was huge. It was modern. It was needed. But it was also a branch. Plant inside a multinational machine, and branch plants can rise quickly when strategy favors them. They can also be exposed quickly when strategy turns away. If the Anglia introduced Halewood, the Escort made it famous. The Ford Escort became one of the defining cars of Britain and Europe. It was practical, familiar, adaptable, and widely used. It served families, fleets, tradesmen, young drivers, commuters, and enthusiasts. In different forms and generations, it became woven into ordinary life. For Halewood, the Escort was more than a product. It was an anchor. It gave the factory a long industrial purpose. It justified tooling, supplier relationships, training, improvements, and employment. It kept the plant inside Ford's mainstream European business. This was exactly the kind of car Halewood had been built to make: high volume, recognizable, and central to the mass market. It did not depend on luxury. It depended on scale. Around the Escort grew an entire ecosystem. There were component suppliers, transport firms, maintenance contractors, cleaning staff, canteen workers, security teams, toolmakers, electricians, drivers, and local businesses that lived from the plant's daily movement. If someone said they worked at Ford, they did not need to explain much more. The blue oval at the gate carried weight. It meant a real job. It meant industrial status. It meant Merseyside was still making something the country could see. But the Escort, years were never simple. Mass production is not romantic when you are standing on the line. The speed of the conveyor dictated the day. Management wanted efficiency, output, and cost control. Workers wanted pay, safety, dignity, and security. Unions were powerful because the plant was powerful. When Ford stopped, the consequences could travel far beyond Merseyside. By the 1970s, British manufacturing was under intense pressure. Inflation, wage restraint, industrial disputes, political conflict, and arguments over productivity shaped the national mood. Factories became battlegrounds not only over pay, but over who had power in the economy. Halewood was part of that wider conflict. The 1978 Ford strike, which began with walkouts at Halewood and Southampton before spreading, became one of the major industrial disputes of the period. It was about wages, but also about dignity. It was about whether workers should carry the cost of economic restraint while prices rose around them. For people on the line, these were not abstract political questions. They were about food bills, rent, mortgages, children over time, and whether a profitable company had the right to ask them to accept less. This is part of why Halewood became such a contested name. To some observers, it symbolized the weaknesses of British manufacturing: industrial conflict, uneven quality, old working practices, and confrontation. To others, it represented something very different: a workforce defending itself in a hard industry, in a region where secure jobs were too valuable to lose quietly. Both views are incomplete on their own. Halewood was not simply a heroic workforce betrayed by management. It was not simply a troubled workforce damaging its own future. It was a factory caught inside the contradictions of the post-war industrial settlement. The system promised stable mass employment, but demanded constant productivity gains. It relied on workers' skill and cooperation, but often treated labor as a cost to be contained. It tied whole communities to giant employers, while allowing the most important decisions to be made far away from those communities. For years, the Escort helped hide those contradictions. As long as the car sold, Halewood mattered. But no car carries a factory forever. A large car plant changes the geography around it. It changes roads. Bus routes, shift patterns, traffic, habits, and expectations. It changes where young people look for their first serious job. It creates a local language of gates, departments, supervisors, shop stewards, stoppages, overtime, layoffs, model changes, and rumors. Halewood became one of those places where the factory was not separate from the community. It was part of the community's nervous system. The people who worked there were not just employees. They were fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, neighbors, customers, club members, and relatives. When the plant was busy, money moved through the area. When the plant was threatened, fear moved faster. This is why industrial decline is never only about production numbers. From a corporate office, a factory can look like a calculation. It can be compared with another plant in Germany, Spain, Turkey, or Eastern Europe. It can be judged by cost per unit, quality ratings, logistics, labor flexibility, government incentives, and platform strategy. But locally, a factory is also memory. A worker remembers the first walk through the gate. A family remembers the first Ford wage packet. A child remembers a parent leaving before sunrise. A town remembers the pride of making cars seen across the country. The problem is that memory does not guarantee investment. By the 1980s and 1990s, car manufacturing was becoming more integrated, more competitive, and more European in structure. Plants were no longer competing only against outside rivals. They were competing against other plants inside the same company. Ford could compare Halewood with Saarlouis in Germany and Valencia in Spain. It could decide where a future model should be built. It could consolidate production. It could move the next generation of work to the sites that best matched its long-term plans. This internal competition was one of Halewood's deepest vulnerabilities. A factory can improve and still lose. It can be productive and still be passed over. It can build a famous car for decades and still discover that the next famous car belongs somewhere else. That is what made the late 1990s so painful. Halewood had already endured criticism, job losses, pressure, and change. It had already been pushed to improve quality and productivity. It had already tried to move beyond its reputation. Then Ford's new compact family car arrived, but it did not arrive at Halewood. It arrived as the Ford Focus, and production was allocated elsewhere. That decision cut deeper than an ordinary model change. In car manufacturing, a new model is not just a product. It is investment, tooling, training, supplier contracts, future volumes, and years of employment. To lose a new model is to lose the next chapter before it begins. The old Escort line could continue for a time, but the future had already moved. For Halewood, the loss of the Focus was the moment the old bargain began to break. The workers had helped build Ford's success. The region had given Ford land, labor, loyalty, and decades of output. But Ford's European strategy no longer needed Halewood in the same way. The factory was not yet silent, But something fundamental had changed. By the time Halewood entered the 1990s, it carried a reputation that was difficult to escape. Some of that reputation came from real problems. The plant had known industrial conflict. It had faced productivity pressures. It had been associated with quality concerns and difficult labor relations, just as parts of British manufacturing more widely had been. But some of the reputation came from stereotype. It became easy to tell a simple story about militant workers, northern decline, and a factory trapped in the past. Simple stories are dangerous because they are often useful to people making difficult decisions. A plant can improve its quality. It can reduce disputes. It can modernize working practices. It can become more efficient. But once a place has been labeled difficult, every future problem is interpreted as proof that the label was right. Halewood's defenders argued that the workforce had changed. They argued that quality had improved, that productivity had risen, and that the plant was being judged by an older version of itself. They argued that the workers were not responsible for Ford Europe's wider strategy, or for the Escort's weakening position in the market. They also argued something more uncomfortable, that Halewood was vulnerable not simply because of performance, but because of where it sat inside Ford's European map. Other plants had political, economic, logistical, and strategic advantages. Labor laws, redundancy costs, government incentives, and platform planning all mattered. In such a system, the official explanation for a decision is rarely the whole explanation. That is why the lazy version of the story does not work. Halewood did not decline because of one cause. It declined as the result of overlapping pressures. The Escort was aging. Ford needed a stronger response to competitors. European production was being rationalized. The company had to decide how many plants it needed. Other factories were better placed for the new strategy. Halewood's reputation may have made the decision easier to defend, but reputation alone did not determine the future. The wider car industry had changed. Mass production no longer guaranteed mass security. The same company that once needed a huge British plant to feed a domestic market could now serve Britain from a continental network. Cars could be designed, sourced, assembled, and distributed across borders in ways that weakened the old link between local loyalty and local production. This was globalization in its most practical form, not a slogan, not a theory, a logistics decision, a boardroom allocation. A family in Merseyside hearing that the next model would be built somewhere else. The pain was sharpened because Halewood had not stopped being useful overnight. The plant still had skilled workers. It still had infrastructure. It still had decades of manufacturing knowledge. It still had people who knew how to build cars at scale. But in a multinational company, history is not the same as future work. Future work must be won again and again. Once the focus went elsewhere, Halewood was no longer fighting for prestige. It was fighting for survival. The decision not to build the focus at Halewood marked the end of an era. For decades, the factory's identity had been tied to Ford's mainstream cars. The Escort had anchored the site. The workforce, suppliers, production lines, and surrounding community all depended on the assumption that Halewood would remain part of Ford's high-volume future. But Ford's European map was being redrawn. Saint-Louis and Valencia became central to the focus. Halewood was left with the outgoing Escort for a time and a growing uncertainty about what would follow. In industrial terms, this was a demotion. It did not mean the factory had no value. It meant the factory had lost its central place inside Ford's mainstream strategy. This is where the story becomes more complicated than a simple shutdown. Ford did not immediately abandon the site. Instead, Halewood became a place of transition. The Escort world began to wind down. The question became whether the plant could be reinvented before it was discarded. The answer came through a very different badge. Jaguar. Ford had bought Jaguar in 1989, and the brand needed growth. Jaguar had heritage, style, and prestige, but it was too small to compete properly with the German luxury brands that dominated the executive market. Ford wanted Jaguar to expand. That meant creating a smaller, more accessible Jaguar. Say a car that could reach buyers who might otherwise choose BMW, Mercedes-Benz, or Audi. That car became the Jaguar X-Type. For Halewood, the X-Type was a lifeline. It meant investment. It meant refurbishment. It meant the plant would not simply die with the Escort. It meant a workforce long associated with Ford family cars would now be asked to build a Jaguar. The contrast was enormous. Halewood had been known for cars of ordinary Britain. Now it would build a car carrying one of Britain's most famous luxury names. A factory built for Anglias and Escorts would now be associated with leather, wood trim, executive ambition, and premium branding. But the gamble carried risk from the beginning. The X-Type was asked to do several difficult things at once. It had to grow Jaguar sales. It had to compete with German rivals. It had to protect the Jaguar image. It had to use Ford resources efficiently. And it had to give Halewood a future. That is a lot for one car to carry. Factories often survive through compromises like this. A plant does not always receive the perfect product. It receives the product that corporate strategy makes available. The workers then have to turn that strategy into real cars: steel, glass, paint, wiring, trim, engines, dashboards, inspections, and finished vehicles leaving the gate. The arrival of Jaguar changed Halewood's culture. Quality expectations rose. The old reputation had to be shaken off. Working practices changed. The factory environment changed. The language of the plant changed. A place once defined by Ford volume was being asked to perform a different kind of manufacturing identity. And for a time, the transformation worked. Halewood did not close, it adapted. But adaptation is not the same as security. The end of Ford car production at Halewood was not only a corporate change, it was symbolic. For decades, the site had been part of the Ford story in Britain. The blue oval had shaped the identity of the plant, the workforce, and the surrounding communities. Even people who never worked there understood what Ford Halewood meant. Then the meaning changed. Ford no longer used Halewood to build complete Ford cars. The old mass-market identity was gone. What remained was more complex. Jaguar production, later Land Rover production, and Ford's continuing presence through components rather than finished cars. The badge on the finished vehicle changed. The nature of the work changed. The place survived. But it survived by becoming less recognizable to the generation that had built its reputation. That is one of the hardest parts of industrial transformation to capture. From the outside, survival can look like success. The gates are still open. The buildings are still active. Workers are still employed. New investment arrives. Politicians speak of the future. But inside the community, something has still been lost. The old certainty has gone. The idea that Ford Halewood would keep building the next Ford family car had been broken. The plant no longer had a natural place in the product line that had once defined it. Every future had to be negotiated. Every new model had to be justified. Every investment had to be earned. For older workers, the change must have carried mixed emotions. Jaguar meant survival. It meant work. It meant pride of a different kind. But it also confirmed that the Escort world was overdot. A factory can remain open and still lose part of itself. That was Halewood's condition at the turn of the century. It had avoided the fate of becoming a silent ruin. But it had entered a new era where reinvention was no longer optional. It was the price of existence. The Jaguar X-Type gave Halewood a second life. But it did not restore the world Halewood had lost. That distinction matters. A mass car plant built around high-volume Ford models had become dependent on a lower-volume premium car. The site survived, but the industrial logic changed. The work became tied not to mass mobility, but to brand expansion. The X-Type was important because Jaguar needed new buyers. It was smaller and more accessible than traditional Jaguars. It offered features intended to broaden the brand's appeal, including all-wheel drive in early versions, diesel options, and an estate body style. But the car lived under suspicion from the beginning. To some buyers, it was not Jaguar enough. To some critics, its Ford connections weakened its prestige. To others, it was a practical attempt to modernize a brand that could not survive on nostalgia alone. For Halewood, those arguments were secondary. On the factory floor, the question was simpler. Were cars being ordered? Were shifts running? Was investment continuing? Was the plant still part of the future? Every X-Type built meant work. Every day of production meant wages. Every improvement in quality helped defend the plant against its past reputation. Still, the car could not escape the market it entered. The compact executive segment was fiercely competitive. German brands had strong identities, loyal customers, and powerful leasing appeal. Jaguar was trying to move downward into a new market without damaging the prestige that made the badge valuable in the first place. That is one of the hardest moves a luxury brand can make. Then, the wider economy turned. By the late 2000s, the global financial crisis shook the car industry. Premium sales weakened. Jaguar Land Rover, now under new ownership after Ford sold Jaguar and Land Rover to Tata Motors, faced hard choices. The X-Type ended in 2009. For Halewood, this meant more uncertainty, more job losses, and another painful reminder that the plant's fate still depended on product decisions made far above the local community. The pattern was familiar. A car had carried the plant. Then the car was withdrawn. The workforce waited again for the next industrial answer. This time, the answer did not come from Jaguar saloons. It came from Land Rover, the Freelander 2, and then the Range Rover Evoque pushed Halewood in a new direction. The plant moved deeper into SUVs at exactly the moment when global demand for SUVs was becoming one of the strongest forces in the car market. This was not a return to the Escort era. It was something stranger and more modern. Merseyside factory originally built for mass. Ford Cars was becoming part of a luxury SUV strategy under Indian ownership. Halewood had survived again, but each survival required another shedding of its old identity. The Range Rover Evoque became one of the most important vehicles in Halewood's later history. It was compact, stylish, premium, and global. It did not look like the industrial Britain that had built the plant. It looked like a different consumer world, design-led, brand-conscious, urban, expensive, and aspirational. The Escort had represented mass mobility. The Evoque represented premium lifestyle. The Escort helped ordinary families enter the road age. The Evoque belonged to an era in which design, height, safety, image, and brand identity shaped what people wanted from a car. For Halewood, the Evoque brought momentum. Demand helped strengthen the plant's position. The site became associated not only with decline and rescue, but with revival. The Discovery Sport later added to Halewood's Land Rover role. The factory that had once lost the focus was now building vehicles that mattered deeply to Jaguar Land Rover's future, but the revival carried lessons of its own. The first lesson was that industrial survival often depends on receiving the right product at the right time. A committed workforce matters. Investment matters. Skills matter. But a factory also needs a vehicle the market. Once the Evoque arrived when compact luxury SUVs were rising. That timing mattered enormously. The second lesson was that ownership change does not always mean disappearance. When Ford sold Jaguar and Land Rover to Tata Motors, it marked the end of one era, but it also opened the possibility of another. Under new ownership, Halewood became part of a different strategy, with different priorities and different risks. The third lesson was that the workforce remained one of the site's strongest assets. Buildings can be refurbished. Robots can be installed. Lines can be extended. Software systems can be added. But a plant also depends on people who understand manufacturing discipline. Halewood's workers had lived through Ford, Jaguar Land Rover recession, model changes, reputational battles, and repeated uncertainty. That experience mattered. Still, even in revival, the old vulnerability remained. Halewood was still dependent on decisions made inside a global company. It was still exposed to market cycles. It was still vulnerable to shifts in consumer taste, government policy, supply chains, technology, and competition. And by the 2020s, the next great shift had already arrived. The internal combustion age was ending. For a factory that began with small petrol cars in the 1960s, the electric transition was not just another model change. It was a structural break. Engines, transmissions, batteries, electric drive units, high-voltage systems, software, charging, robotics, and new safety procedures all changed the logic of production. The question returned once more. Could Halewood reinvent itself again? The latest chapter of Halewood is not silence, it is reconstruction. On one part of the historic site, Jaguar Land Rover has been transforming Halewood for electric vehicle production. New production lines, robotics, digital systems, high-voltage training, battery-related processes, and expanded facilities all point toward a factory being prepared for the next generation of vehicles. On another part of the site, Ford's remaining Halewood operation has moved from the old world of transmissions toward electric drive units. The symbolism is difficult to miss. The company that once built complete Ford cars at Halewood no longer uses the site that way. But Ford still sees value there, not in Anglias, not in Escorts, not in a family hatchback line, but in components for the electric age. This is what industrial continuity now looks like, not the same product forever, not the same badge forever, not the same workforce structure forever. Continuity now means the ability to absorb disruption, retrain people, rebuild lines, install new systems, and remain useful when the technology changes. But it would be too easy to tell this as a clean success story. Electric transformation is not magic. It does not automatically replace every job lost in older forms of manufacturing. It requires huge investment. It changes skills. It introduces new dependencies on batteries, software, minerals, global supply chains, government rules, charging infrastructure, and consumer demand. The modern factory may be more advanced, but it is not necessarily less vulnerable. In the old industrial world, a plant might stop because steel was delayed, workers walked out, demand fell, or a machine failed. In the new industrial world, a plant can also stop because software fails, digital systems are disrupted, or a supply network breaks somewhere far away. The factory is no longer only a building full of machines. It is a network of data, logistics, automation, suppliers, workers, energy systems, and code. That is the world Halewood has entered. In the 1960s, Halewood represented scale, a huge building, thousands of workers, and cars rolling off the line for ordinary Britain. In the 1970s and 1980s, it represented conflict and endurance, the politics of wages, productivity, quality, and industrial power. In the 1990s, it represented vulnerability, a branch plant waiting to learn whether the future would be assigned to Merseyside or somewhere else. In the 2000s, it represented reinvention, Jaguar, Land Rover, and the end of the old Ford identity. In the 2020s, it represents transformation again, electric vehicles, electric drive units, robotics, retraining, and the uncertain promise of green manufacturing. So what disappeared? Not the site, not all the work, not the manufacturing skill. What disappeared was the old certainty, the belief that a great factory, once built, would naturally keep building the next version of the car that made it famous, the belief that loyalty and history would guarantee future investment, the belief that mass production and mass employment would remain tied permanently to one place. Halewood teaches a harder lesson. Factories do not survive because they once mattered. They survive because someone decides they matter again, and every generation has to win that decision under new conditions. The men and women who built Anglias and Escorts could not have imagined a future of electric drive units, autonomous robots, high-voltage training, luxury SUVs, and digital production systems, but they would have recognized the deeper reality, the need for work, the pride of making something real, and the anxiety that comes when distant decisions decide local lives. That is why Halewood still matters. It is not just a story about Ford. It is not just a story about Jaguar Land Rover. It is not just a story about one factory outside Liverpool. It is a story about what happens when industrial places are asked, again and again, to prove their right to exist. The factory that once helped make the future affordable for ordinary homes is now being rebuilt for a future that is more expensive, more technical, and less certain. The Escort lines are gone. The Ford family cars are gone. The original bargain between mass employment and mass production has been broken and rewritten many times, but the site remains. That is the quiet power of the story. Halewood did not simply close its gates and become a ruin. It became something more complicated, a survivor of industrial transformation, carrying the memory of Ford's mass-market empire while trying to earn a place in the electric age. Its story leaves behind a question larger than any one company. When the products change, when the owners change, when the machines change, and when the badge on the building no longer means what it once meant, what is a factory really? Is it a place, a workforce, a memory, a system, or is it a promise that has to be rebuilt every time the world changes? If this story made you think differently about the factories behind the cars, the workers behind the badges, and the towns behind the production lines, subscribe to the channel. We uncover the forgotten industrial stories that built the modern world, and the ones history almost left behind.